bit to cover today, so I will keep moving through. If I'm moving through too quickly, if you can just make a note in the question and answer. And again, as I said, there's some time at the end for questions. So what we're covering off on today is just a general overview of the R&D tax incentive program, including the eligibility requirements and the applicability to the manufacturing sector. We're also going to talk a little bit about the compliance environment that we currently have and the watch points that AusIndustry and the ATO are looking at the moment. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the registration form tips and the proposed changes that may be coming through at some point. So just a bit of background on the Research and Development Tax Incentive Program. It's been around in various forms since the mid-80s. It's the government's preeminent industry-based R&D program, and it's aimed at encouraging companies to engage in research and development that they wouldn't normally engage in. It offsets some of the costs of the R&D expenditure that you incur to take on these more riskier activities than your business as usual. An important point to note is that it's a self-assessed program. It is not a grant. So the process is that you lodge the R&D activities with AusIndustry, and then you can lodge the expenditure, the related expenditure, through your tax return. Lodgement in itself is not an approval of your activities, and you may be reviewed at a later stage, just like you would with your personal tax, to prove that you have got R&D and you've got some substantiation behind the projects. So we'll talk a bit further about that further on. It's more targeted towards the SMEs, and that's because of the refundable nature of the offset, but for the smaller entities, but it is open to companies of any size. It is across industries, so it covers all industries, including manufacturing, engineering, ICT, medical, biotech, and so the R&D legislation has been written across industries and isn't specific to one. And it's not just what we would view as white lab code work. Historically, what research and development might have been viewed as, so it is industry-based. The key eligibility criteria that needs to be met is that you need to be a company incorporated in Australia. So trusts and trustees, individuals, are not eligible to claim the R&D tax incentive program. The companies need to register with AusIndustry around their technical activities within 10 months of the end of financial year. So for a company with the 30th of June year end, you have until April 30 the following year to register your R&D activities. You have to register your activities before you can register the related costs. For this year, as a result of, well, for the last financial year that is, as a result of the COVID-19, normally that deadline would have been the 30th of April for the June 2019 year end. That's been extended to September 2020. So if you've got a claim that you haven't put in for the last financial period and you've got eligible documentation and eligible R&D, you can still claim until the 30th of September 2020. So it's just an extension as a result of COVID-19. So for the current financial year, we don't see any extension at this point. So you will need to register your R&D activities by the 30th of April 2021. But of course, the sooner you get it in after the end of financial year, the sooner you can access the offset. So what is that offset and what is the benefit of claiming research and development? As we talked about before, the benefit is that is greater for small to medium enterprises, and SMEs are in this case defined as with a turnover of less than 20 million. So for companies with a turnover of less than 20 million, it's a 43.5% refundable tax offset if you're in losses. So it's otherwise offset against your tax liability, but if you're in losses, that can be refunded out. So if you spent 100,000 and you're in losses, you could refund out that 43,500, which is good for cash flow. For larger companies, the benefit's slightly less, it's 38.5%, and it's non-refundable. So larger companies are defined in this case as being greater than 20 million annual turnover. So that 38.5%, if the company's in losses, the losses are carried forward. So there's no refundable element for larger companies. The last tier to discuss is if you have R&D expenditure in the order of 100 million annually, you can only claim that first 100 million at 38.5%, and expenditure over this amount is claimable at 30%, the company tax rate. So Companies normally would refer to R&D as R&D projects rather than R&D activities. The legislation defines as two sorts of activities rather than projects, so core R&D and supporting R&D activities. They're both claimable at the same rate, but they are needing to be described differently in the R&D application. So the dollars are the same in terms of, you know, the benefit, but they do need to be separated out, both in your technical and in your costs. So core R&D activities are experimental activities, and that's the starting point. So as we talked about before, this is to encourage research and development, and by that it's experimental activities where the outcome cannot be determined in advance at the outset. So that's that at the start of the project, you don't know for sure whether you'll get from A to B or whether or not you'll achieve your objective at B. So it could be also in process as well as outcome. So uncertainty can exist in both. It needs to follow a systematic progression of work. So it needs to be based on principles of established science, proceeding from hypothesis, and that's an important point to make, which we'll talk a bit further about, through to experimentation, evaluation, and then the R&D legislation refers to it as a logical conclusion, which isn't always the case in R&D. So it needs to follow a systematic progression of work. So that's the method test there. The last is the purpose test. Why are you doing the R&D? And that can be for the development of new knowledge in the form of a new or improved product, process, service, system, device, material. So improved is a key word as part of that as well, in terms of it doesn't have to just be new. It can be an improvement where there's a technical unknown and a systematic progression of work. So I'll talk a little bit further about that with an example, particularly for the manufacturing sector shortly. But that's the definition. The bold words highlighted there are the key parts that you need to meet for each of your activities, for each of your core activities. The second category of activities is the supporting R&D activity, and those are the ones that aren't experimental in their own right, but they're directly related to the core activities. So directly related is defined as having a direct, close and relatively immediate relationship with the core R&D activities. So that is that the work needs to be done around the same time effectively as your core activities. And sometimes we call the supporting R&D activity but for test. But for doing that supporting activity, we couldn't have done the core activity. So the sorts of things that would be claimable as a supporting activity might be background research, might be some standard test work, might be travel to a conference. So they're all supporting the research and development, but in themselves they're not experimental. Might be reviewing data and the like, which in itself may not be, is not experimental. I should point out this last bit of this slide here, which is the dominant purpose test, which is definitely applicable to where you're producing a good or service. So if your R&Ds, there are excluded activities, which we haven't provided a list on here. The excluded activities are things that is accessible on the AusIndustry website, and it'll include things like social sciences, exploration, regulatory activities. The dominant purpose test means that those activities can't be claimed as a core, but they may be a supporting activity if they meet this dominant purpose test. So an example of that may be that if, for instance, you were developing a piece of plant for a mining site, and in order to use that, trial that piece of plant or trial that piece of equipment on a mining site, you needed to get meet Australian standards prior to the testing. It may well be that that would be the reason that you would get that standards or regulatory testing undertaken is in order to do your R&D experimentation. So the dominant purpose is an additional requirement for those supporting activities when you're in a production setting or when they're on the excluded list. The other thing to note, I guess, at this point is in relation to what is a business as usual activity. So in recent years, there's been a lot of dialogue about the R&D tax incentive program and the concept of that additionality or spillover benefit to the Australian government, to the Australian nation. So as part of this, AusIndustry identified that many companies were claiming what was their normal business, or with only a small part that was related to an R&D. So they determined that business as usual needed to be carved out. So activities relating to business as usual needs to be carved out of your R&D claim and your timesheets. An example of this may be that, for instance, if I have a client who does drug development, cancer drug development, they're in a clinical trial stage. AusIndustry and the ATO require them to carve out the chief scientists, some of the chief scientists' time related to business as usual activities, and they might be reporting to the board, they might be related to recruitment, it might be related to capital funding or talking to banks and capital raising or talking to banks and the like. So those sorts of things are seen as what a person would do in a normal business, regardless of the fact that this is largely an R&D company. So the concept of R&D company doesn't really exist. You need to carve out those activities that would be done in any business. So that business as usual is important when you're looking at your timesheets. And there's some more information there on that taxpayer alert below. So what type of expenditure is claimable? The minimum claim is $20,000 unless you're engaging a research service provider, and that would be a university, institutions, research institutions like CSIRO and the like. So in that case, if you have less than $20,000, you can put in a claim for a research service provider, but otherwise for most companies, it's the minimum claim is $20,000. And the sorts of expenditure that you can claim relate to salary and wages on those tasks, contractor or consultants that you engage, again, the research service providers, some direct expenditure which may relate to consumable, travel, some of those regulatory testings, for instance, also depreciation as that piece of equipment is used on R&D, and indirect expenses such as overheads. Now, AusIndustry and the ATO are recently liking the concept of claiming overheads less, and while they haven't legislated against it at the moment, they may well do that in due course. So it's important to, I guess, have a reasonable position around your overheads that you're claiming. Some of the ways people claim overheads, which may include electricity, rent and the like, is to claim it on the basis of R&D effort over total sorry, I was just reading questions at the same time, R&D effort over total salary and wages, and that applied to the rent, for instance. So if one person out of 10 is engaged 20% of their time on R&D, it may be you pick up that proportion of the rent as part of the overhead apportionment. But again, there's no legislated way to pick up those indirect costs. The sorts of expenditure that is not claimable is core technology, as defined in the Tax Act. Payments to associates that have not been paid in the year. So you might have incurred an invoice to an associate but not physically made that payment, in which case you can only pick up the associate payment once it's been paid. Intercompany markups are not claimable, interest, building expenditure, and expenditure not at risk. Expenditure not at risk is when you are guaranteed returns, when you're effectively given an amount of money regardless of the outcome. That would be seen as expenditure not at risk. One point that I will make at the moment is in relation to overseas expenditure. You can't claim overseas expenditure unless you've got an overseas finding. So historically you used to be able to claim what was called incidental overseas expenditure, and that might be travel or attendance to a conference. Now AusIndustry and the ATO are looking to, and I sit on a state reference group board, not the board, and which is with AusIndustry and the ATO and a number of R&D consultants. And recent feedback has been that they don't want to encourage claiming incidental overseas expenditure, which is a small amount of overseas expenditure at all. So that's a shift away from where they used to be. But for companies doing R&D overseas or having R&D expenditure, you need to do and you need to apply for an overseas finding within the financial year. Again, that deadline would normally be before 30th of June, but has been extended to the 30th of September. But you do still need to put in a provisional finding by this year for any R&D that's occurred this year. Now, there are additional criteria around that, and that is a whole webinar in itself, which we may be running in the next month in any event. But just to make a note that if you want to claim overseas findings, overseas activities, you'll need to put in an overseas finding. So it's not claimable under the Australian program unless you have an overseas finding. I'll just touch on this briefly. So feedstock occurs when you have a marketable product or a saleable product as a result of your R&D being undertaken. Now the feedstock calculation is quite convoluted and quite difficult to apply. It has a report on it from the ATO that's many, many, many pages long and is, again, a session in itself. I would just say that if you are producing a good or service, you will be, and you wish to claim some of those feedstock inputs, you are subject to this feedstock adjustment, which means you can claim those, but there is an adjustment which occurs by adding back to the assessable income, and that adjustment is due to kind of reduce the incentive component for the R&D tax, so to reduce that amount. It's calculated on the basis of a third, the lesser of a third of either those feedstock inputs as defined in the legislation or the sale price or the value afterwards. So it's a convoluted calculation. But I guess that, and if you've got questions about it, probably come to me afterwards in relation to how the feedstock applies. But you also have the choice of not claiming any feedstock expenditure because AusIndustry and the ATO recognise how difficult this feedstock adjustment is to understand. So we'll talk about, I just wanted to touch on that rather than give too much information on it, just because it is quite confusing in any event. So I'll just talk a little bit about the program in itself, just to give some background to the compliance questions at the moment. As you can see from here, this was some data that was released by AusIndustry in relation to the 2017-2018 financial year. The total R&D claims were costing around 12.2 billion with 12,500 registrations. You can see the majority of them fit under that refundable element. So the SMEs make up the majority of claims, but the costs are probably fairly even between small and large corporates. So there's far less claims under the large corporates, but obviously they're quite expensive. R&D, whereas the smaller companies, there's far more claims, and that would be understandable given the refundable nature, which is of more interest. So that's, I guess the key figure to look at there is in relation to that 12.2 billion. Originally, this program was forecast to be a great deal less than that 12.2 billion, and the success of the program has meant an increased focus on compliance elements. In addition, just further to that program snapshot at the moment, is that this sort of the breakdown across industries where professional services is things like biotech and ICT type of medtech, those sorts of areas around professional services, the more scientific types of projects sitting under that professional services banner. Manufacturing is the next largest area that is claimed under R&D, with mining, agri and other being a catch-all for other sorts of areas. So you can see that manufacturing is a really significant component of the program. So what sorts of things are research and development or claimable research and development in manufacturing? So that purpose test we talked about before, developing new or improved products or processes, is generally where we see most of our R&D in manufacturing. And the improved element, as I touched on before, is quite an important part of it. So having an improvement to an existing product or process where it meets the other eligibility criteria can satisfy the R&D tax incentive program. Those sorts of things might be efficiency improvements, or looking at making it stronger, using less material and lightweighting, using lower power consumption and the like. So efficiency improvements might be where your R&D is at. R&D to achieve cost-cutting measures. So while our cost-cutting is not a technical objective in itself, how you get there may well be. So it may well be that you have a material that has increased in price significantly, and you're needing to do some research and development to replace that material with a cheaper, different type of option where there's a technical uncertainty and experimental process to do that. So in itself, financial outcomes aren't the reason for doing R&D, but how you get there is where the R&D might sit. Again, we just touched about the next generation types of materials. Also with different changes happening all the time. For instance, removing volatile organic compounds in paint manufacture, looking at different, is one of my clients' work where they're looking at trying to remove this, but there are outcomes to the product that are undesirable that they need to remove as well. So it might be looking at different raw materials as well, might be where your R&D, or looking at getting efficiencies on production lines. Problem solving is another key area, so and often a good area to point to where there might be R&D. So if you have a product or a process that has a problem, and you need to do research and development to overcome that problem, that may fit under the R&D elements in manufacturing. Key to identifying whether or not you have a project is whether or not you have a technical hypothesis at the outset and an unknown outcome at the outset. So that's that key requirement, is what you're testing for and what you don't know at the start. I'm just going to talk very briefly and at a high level in relation to this manufacturing case study, just to try to, I guess, enunciate where some R&D might be in this case. So this is a case in relation to developing a new paper towel product where the company wished to achieve improved strength when wet. So they were looking for an improved strength when wet. Additionally, they were also looking at wanting to reduce the pulp in the paper towel product because the majority of the costs sat with the pulp cost. So the company hypothesised that they can improve that wet strength by a measurable amount, by twofold, by a new embossing pattern and reduced pulp input. So the company engaged in testing and developing and trying different embossing patterns, looking at different pulp lays over the paper, pulp for the paper development, and then tested, I guess, the end product for that wet strength, because the pulp ratio was what was currently providing that strength in that in the paper towel. So importantly, the company sets up at the start a project initiation form and documentation to track the costs and for the inputs. So it's important to make sure that when you identify a hypothesis that you start setting up your documentation to support that. In this case, there was a pilot plant rather than a production line, and a number of different conditions were trialled at different depths of embossing, at different amounts of pulp to mix, and then they did some testing on that strength characteristic. They reached a conclusion in relation to the amount of pulp and the amount of pulp that they could sustain to still achieve a wet strength, and also which pattern was providing that strength. So I guess the point of this is that they had a hypothesis to test against, which is that twofold of strength improvement and at what rate. And they went through experimentation and comparative experimentation to determine that. So that's just an example, albeit perhaps not explained the best. It is actually a real case example. But that is just an example of one of the sorts of things that we might look at, where you may not think that research and development occurs at the manufacturing area, this is your normal improvements that you would undertake for the, as part of your normal manufacturing developments, which can still fit under the R&D banner. So just talking a little bit about the compliance environment. So we talked on that spread of activities, of costs and where they're across at the moment. That increase in cost compared to what the government initially forecast around the R&D tax program has been blown out by AusIndustry, in that it has been successful. It has been greater cost than what they expected. And as a result, the compliance environment, there is a focus on the compliance elements for companies claiming. The scheme is jointly administered by AusIndustry and the ATO. AusIndustry look after the technical elements of it, and the ATO look after the financial elements of the project. So it's a little bit of a different scheme than most programs, where it has a dual regulator associated with it. You might have a review by one of those parties or both of those parties, and it should be known that while AusIndustry will look at the technical, they'll also be interested in the costs, and the ATO will look at the financial, but they'll also be interested in the technical. So while they are ostensibly meant to look after one area, it's obviously hard for them to review the costs in the absence of understanding the technical and vice versa. The sorts of reviews you may have are around the registration, so that initial desktop review, and that's why it's really important to get your registration correct. It might be in relation to an activity, so they may review an activity, or they might do large business reviews, which are the larger scale projects. If you're unsuccessful through a range of reviews, you may appeal through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, but that's at the moment we're seeing most cases be negotiated out before that AAT. So just a snapshot of where things are at from the current compliance environment is that a lot of them have failed on the basis of documentation. So it may be that they have not supported their claims or not described their claims appropriately under the R&D registration documentation. So it's important, and again that raises the point of documentation and the importance, which I will probably rabbit on about a fair bit coming up in the next few slides. And in addition to that, getting your application right is really, really important as well to try to avoid, I guess, a review because they can be quite costly and quite time consuming. So you need to keep, and the other point to make is while people often will have documentation in relation to the R&D, they won't have tracked documentation in relation to their costs very well. So splitting out that core and supporting, cordoning off production runs from R&D, looking at, looking at ways that that contractor was involved with the R&D and booking it to job codes and the like. So it's important to make sure you look at your costs being incurred rather than an assessment at the end of the financial year of what costs related to it is to try and track them at the same time. Okay. And the other point to make there was that uncertainty at the outcome hadn't been identified. It was reasonable that the company would expect to solve that R&D, so they deemed it as not being R&D. So that reasonable expectation that they can predict the outcome at the start. And that's why it's important for companies to set up a project initiation form or at the start of their project, or some sort of documentation at the start of their projects or activities to identify what those technical unknowns are at the outset, because as we all know that R&D moves pretty quickly and your unknowns at the outset can change 10 times over as you progress through the project. And trying to understand those unknowns at the outset 18 months down the track is virtually impossible. The other point is that whole of project. So companies need to be sure that they're claiming it on an activity basis rather than a whole of project. It may be the whole project's claimable, but it's the way you describe that that's important in your documentation. So that's breaking down the activities rather than just putting in one overarching activity. So tips to help avoid a compliance review. As I said, they're mainly, compliance reviews are generally initiated by companies failing to describe the R&D activities adequately on the registration form. So AusIndustry and the ATO can't assess based on the information being provided. It might be too less, not enough detail, or not sophisticated enough description, or it may be that there's copious amounts of information and hard for them to pick through it, so they'll start a review to try and understand it a bit better. So key watch points would be to clearly identify your experimental activity. So understand at the outset what you're registering and how that's broken down. So a bit of a mind map really effectively of what those activities are and how they're broken down before you start your registration documentation. Key to the registration documentation is also including a clear and measurable hypothesis. So many companies, one of the big points that AusIndustry made was in relation to the way that companies were crafting a hypothesis, and they were saying, we want to develop this product and we don't know if we can do it. And so that was kind of the end point. It didn't have any of the measurable components that they were actually testing for, a hypothesis written, a hypothesis with these measurable outcomes that they were testing for. So it's really important that you have a very clear hypothesis at the outset. And providing enough technical detail, as we talked about before, providing enough technical detail in your registration documentation to ensure that a layperson can understand where the R&D and experimentation has happened. And it's really, the other point that I probably should have put on there as well, is it's really important to explain your experimental method in the core section. So really take the reader through what you did to resolve your hypothesis. So just restating many of those points, it's very important to have a clear and measurable hypothesis. So as I said, I'll say it about 6 times, but it is really important from an AusIndustry. The starting point for their assessment is whether or not you've got something, an experiment that you're testing, and a hypothesis is your starting point. It's written into the legislation as that's been what you're required to have. It's important to provide context to the activity. So in that background section, it's important to provide the lay of the land effectively. So talking about, well, we identified that there wasn't anything like this on the market, or we identified that we needed to make this change because normally we do it this way and we need to make a change for this, but these are our technical uncertainties. So that context and background section is really good at setting is really good to set the scenes rather than just jump straight into the activities. Is really good to provide that new knowledge element really. Use subheadings in the application. So AusIndustry are about to change the form again, and that form will include a breakdown into those areas: hypothesis, experiment, observations, results and conclusions. That doesn't mean each year you need to have results and conclusion. It may be that the work's ongoing and you're still in the experimental stage. But if you do have a conclusion, that's how they want them to break down. So start with the hypothesis, talk about the experiment, and then talk about the observations and results at that point. I'm just trying to work out what that says. Identify the experimental variables, and that's particularly important in software experimentation. I'm not focusing on software in this discussion, but it has had increased compliance. And if you are doing software projects, if you are a software developer, I would suggest really identifying hypotheses and what your technical unknown is. The nature of software is it's quite iterative, and it can be quite iterative, and you can, I guess, move forward into smaller stories and towards your end goal. It's important to probably have an overarching document in addition to just, I guess, your software coding, to talk about what those technical uncertainties are and what you're doing that's experimental and how that compares to what's at the market at the time. The other issue with software is it moves so fast. So it's really important to, at the time you're writing it, is identify what you're doing and how that compares to what else is out there on the market. Describe how the experimentation was undertaken and the uncertainty that you're trying to resolve. So it's just, these are all just points to try and push you towards, I guess, what AusIndustry want to read. And again, I'll point out that they're not experts in your field. They're not, they're completely lay people most of the time. So you need to provide it as if you are providing it to someone who has no knowledge of your R&D specifically. So very rarely do you get a review by someone who is in your area, which can be very frustrating, but that's why the registration form is quite important. Provide enough detail without too much detail. So you are limited in the numbers, in the amount that you can write. You can add, and we often do, add additional documentation to the submission, but you still want to get across your point within the word limit, or at least start to get across your point. Okay, and one thing AusIndustry, the ATO, are after is one supporting activity per core R&D activity. I'm not really sure why they require or why they want one core per supporting, but they do. So when you're doing your R&D application form, just do a core and a supporting together for each of those. And avoid whole of project claims. As I said, they may well be whole of project, but in which case you want all of your core and your supporting activities split out to understand how they're all eligible in their own right. We talked about documentation. Maintaining it at the time you're doing the work is what AusIndustry and the ATO require. That's written into the legislation that you need to maintain contemporaneous documentation, much like you would for your personal tax and say kilometres, claiming your personal tax. Document what's happening at the start of your project. What's your hypothesis? What's your unknown? Overlay your existing documentation. It might be an email that you write. It doesn't always have to be some specific document that you have, but really identify what is your hypothesis and what's unknown at the outset. Of course, track all your activities and document any failures and unexpected outcome. For the costs, you need to split out the core and the supporting activities. And while timesheets are not are required or timesheets are not legislatively outlined as being necessary. Increasingly, AusIndustry and the ATO are moving to timesheets as a justification of the salary and wages that you're claiming. So I would suggest that best practice is to keep timesheets on where you're describing what you did in that time as well, rather than just saying I spent 5 hours on R&D, what activities were you involved in? And work within your existing processes. So if you already have a meeting once every fortnight with the production team, it may well be that you incorporate an R&D element to it to track against those R&D activities and send those minutes around once every fortnight. Or it may be that you have a CapEx document that you use. You might want to modify that for an R&D initiation type of form as well. So look at what you're already doing to track outcomes and see if you can work in an R&D element to it. Sorts of documentation that you, and this is just an example list, this is not a comprehensive list, or you don't need to have this for every project that you're doing, but the sorts of documents might include photos, they might include designs, project records and notebooks, progression of the projects. It might be discussions that you have with a contractor or consultant. It might be test results and conclusions. It might be samples that you retain. So there's lots of different ways of information lots of different sorts of documentation you need to maintain, and it will be specific to the projects that you claim. If you're doing work on a production line, R&D on a production line, make sure you cordon off, if at all possible, an element relating to R&D or develop a reasonable, justifiable position as to why that part is R&D on that production line, why that's part of the process is R&D. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the proposed legislative tax changes. So just to give you a bit of an update of when this was first initiated. The May 2018 budget looked at carving out some of those costs of R&D, 1.8 billion. It was originally rejected it was sent to the Senate's Economics Legislative Committee, and they rejected it. They suggested that there needed to be changes or an amendment to the bill to meet some of these requirements. The bill was then re-released in December of last year with little to no changes to that original one that the Senate Economics Committee had rejected. It's been referred back to the Senate Economics Committee, and we've just found out today that it's going to report that they're not slated to report until the end of the end of calendar year 20, that should be. So towards December this year. We're not sure what period that's going to apply to. We're not sure if it's going to get through. I'm just, I guess, advising you that there are some changes that are proposed but haven't had good support through passage through at the moment. And those changes and how they may affect you is that for small to medium companies with that turnover of less than 20 million, there's a $4 million cap on refunds. So if you're spending greater than 10 million, that may affect you in relation to that refund. Clinical trials are excluded from that, and the clinical trials have been defined as being in human trials. So that $4 million cap on the refund is going to be a change for some companies that are really R&D intensive. Locking in the premium, so originally the 43.5% relied on a 30% tax rate. With the changing of the 30% company tax rate to the 27.5%, companies were receiving that increased benefit as part of the refund. Now the government are looking to lock it to that 13.5%. So regardless of what the company tax rate is. So that'll provide less cash flow to some companies that were the smaller companies that were getting that. When you say overseas expenditure, sorry, I've just seen Henry's question. When you say overseas expenditure, does that mean any R&D activity done overseas? If I am importing a part from overseas and conducting R&D in Australia, is it claimable? So it depends on what that part is, Henry, in relation to whether or not you've had someone develop a part for your purposes. AusIndustry, it's a grey area with the ATO. AusIndustry are, with the ATO and AusIndustry, I should say, the argument they use is if you were getting, say, flour from overseas, was it modified at all for your purposes for you to make the cake over in Australia, then arguably you wouldn't need to do an overseas finding for that part. If there was some sort of modification of that flour for your purposes and coming back to Australia, then arguably you would need to do an overseas finding. You can request a private ruling from the ATO if it's a big expenditure. You can, but it does take some time, and AusIndustry are increasingly trying to push towards a private ruling from the ATO for these positions because it is grey. So I guess it will depend on what that part is and how much work is being done to get that part to you. But we can talk a bit further towards the end if I haven't answered that question enough. So just heading back to the other changes, for larger companies, there's a sliding scale of benefit that is potentially going to be applied, which will make it's to encourage that increase of R&D intensity in a company. So if you have, I've put that sliding scale down there. It's a little bit confusing, as you can imagine. So previously the refundable offset was the non-refundable offset was at 38.5% as a flat amount. Now they're looking at if you have less than 4% of R&D spend against your turnover, then you can claim 4.5 instead of the 8.5. And so on with those other areas. It's very confusing, and for companies in that space, unless you're really highly R&D intensive, which is, you know, that 9% or greater, it may not be worth claiming the R&D going forward. And the other issue is a lot of people are not going to know what the R&D spend is as a proportion of their total spend until the end of that financial year as well. So it's a really problematic part of the proposed legislation. It hasn't had very good support through the Senate, and so I suspect a simplified version of this will result, I hope a simplified version of this will result, and again, or it may be pulled back entirely as a result of this COVID-19 downplay at the moment. So just to summarise, the program is a great program. It has good, valuable benefits for companies that are undertaking R&D, but you do need to do some work behind the scenes to make sure you can claim. So, you know, the old adage, you don't get something for nothing, you know, certainly applies with the tax, with the ATO as well. So documentation is really important, and doing that during the project is key. You need to have strong technical and financial documentation to support your claim. The key areas around manufacturing is that you need to have a hypothesis and technical uncertainty identified at the outset. Think about what documentation you might want to put in place to really enunciate and test against that hypothesis. The conclusions need to relate back to that hypothesis, so think about what you want to test, and you can break that down into sub-hypotheses as well. If you're doing R&D on a production line, cordon off the time where possible on R&D, or develop a reasonable position as to why you're claiming that time. If you're mindful of feedstock calculations, if you're wanting to claim raw materials and you're wanting to claim some of the costs, that might be if you've dumped a product, for instance, might be a good reason why you want to claim feedstock. You know, you have the choice of not claiming feedstock because it is a convoluted exercise, but otherwise have very good documentation to support your feedstock calc. And lastly, that dominant purpose test we talked about when you are producing, or when you are producing goods and services. So just keeping mindful of those. So the last thing I just want to bring to your attention, a couple of grants to consider. The Export Market Development Grant is a great grant, provides up to 50% of some of that expanding into overseas markets. That is a grant as opposed to the tax offset. And the Accelerating Commercialisation Grant is a matched grant as well. Both of those are merit-based, particularly Accelerating Commercialisation. The export market is reviewed by Austrade, and accelerating commercialisation is, but you can do an expression of interest, which is relatively painless to identify whether or not you've got something around that accelerating commercialisation side of things. And that's when you've got a product and you want to look at scale up or a few other areas. The other point, and no doubt SEMA have already absolutely provided these details in the past, but Bev Little is your person in the region to talk about what other things are currently available. My understanding is that there's not a lot of grants available at a state point of view. And as a result of the COVID-19, but there is discretionary funding available, particularly if you're pivoting to support the COVID-19 developments at the moment in terms of manufacturing. So so I guess that summarises what I want to talk about today. And thank you to SEMA for helping us to put together this presentation today.